We are now continuing our Teach Out conversations, this time in the company of Michael Bradley from Georgia State University's Perimeter College. Thank you, Michael, for being here with us.
Pablo, thank you for having me.
Please, I am so interested in your research. Please tell us, how did you start getting interested in your subject?
Well, it comes back to when my wife and I moved to the Atlanta area in '97. And one of the first things we did as new visitors was to go out to Stone Mountain. And I think immediately we were struck by some of the events that we saw and read about and the activities that were happening at the location. We both have backgrounds in religious studies and theology, so the Easter sunrise service immediately caught our attention. It's a long-standing event that they have every year since the early mid-40s, rather, at Stone Mountain. And their Christmas celebration was interesting also. And then, of course, the memorial carving itself, we thought, had interesting implications for individuals who had or knew a little bit about the lost cause and what that represented to the South. And so the more I looked into it, the more I found it of great interest. And then eventually there came an opportunity where I needed a research site for my doctoral program. And I decided, because I am teaching, I'm at a teaching institution, I wanted to incorporate my research into my teaching, and it was a local site that was accessible not only to myself, but to my students, who would be, many of whom would be familiar with it. So I decided to look into that site, and it eventually emerged that I decided to utilize Stone Mountain for what is called a spatial analysis of religion at the site, and that involved my development of 5 case studies of events at Stone Mountain. And I undertook that as a part of my dissertation. I started in 2010 and just did my defense in the fall of 2017 and deposited last summer. And so that was that project.
So you were new to this city. You discovered a fantastic place, very interesting
Very
place.
interesting, yes.
And then you connected it with your own professional, personal plans of,
I did,
of
yes.
becoming a researcher and a teacher.
Yes.
And how did you organize your approach to this place of study?
Well, it turned on again what's called a spatial methodology, which is really an examination of the physical material space itself and how it's used, for example, in the distribution of power among institutions and different groups. The memorial carving itself represents an interesting example of that, because it was put together by proponents of lost cause mythology in the early part of the 20th century. It had a strong involvement with Ku Klux Klan members and national organizations, and became a major focal point for this idea of the South as a source of virtue for its struggles that it experienced during the Civil War, and remembrance of the Confederate dead who were seen as having died in a heroic struggle to maintain the integrity of their reading of the Constitution. At the same time, it downplayed the reality of slavery and what that meant for those individuals, millions of individuals who experienced slavery in the South up until the period of the Civil War. And then it was interesting, as you watched the memorial carving project had its own struggles, and it went into a period of stagnation in the late 20s, and really was only recovered as a serious project in response to Brown v. Board of Education, the landmark legislation which addressed segregation in public schools and then had wider implications for the rest of society in 1954. So in the 50s, there was a governor who campaigned on the promise to finish the memorial carving, which was throughout this time since the late 20s to the 50s unfinished, and a bit of an embarrassment to the region and to the state. And the governor was successful in purchasing the land and finding the funding to start up the carving process again. And they were able to dedicate the memorial carving in 1970 and officially finish it in 1972. And the park then became a memorial park to the Confederacy. All of this in the context, again, of the power contests that were going on between movements for civil rights and the establishment that viewed desegregation as a threat to the dominance of their particular cultural heritage. And that eventually shifted, and you saw that there became a new narrative came onto the scene that focused more on the unity. The symbol of the Confederate Memorial is a symbol of national unity, of recovery from the wounds of the Civil War. So Vice President Agnew's speech at the dedication in 1970 mentioned this idea that the memorial represented the best ideals of what was called the New South, and a progressive notion of moving forward from the past into the future. And you can see this, this kind of idea of the notion of the Civil War being represented as a kind of a sacrifice, a heroic sacrifice to save the Union. And this is represented, for example, in nightly laser light shows that are held at the park. And the great image I like is where General Lee marches through a field of dead soldiers and is obviously struck by what he's seen, and he picks up his sword and breaks it in two, and it falls to the ground and then becomes the two parts of the United States at that time united again. Again, the imagery is striking because it suggests the role of the Civil War from this perspective, this sort of neo-lost cause perspective, as a salvific event for all of the United States.
So this narrative of the New South is not constructed against the Civil War and against the lost cause narrative, but using it as a myth of sacrifice necessary to the New South.
Which is part of the lost cause itself, but what's being downplayed is the insistence on the South as unfairly victimized, that the struggle was to bring about a more perfect union, so to speak, and that's what that sacrifice entailed. So when I see events such as Confederate flag rallies at Stone Mountain, and I go out and I talk with some of the individuals there, it's clear to me that they view the Confederate memorial carving as a symbol of their heritage, as they understand it, run through the filter of the lost cause, and this is why they don't see the implications that it has as a symbol of slavery or white supremacy. And so when you have other groups that come out and counter-protest, it's interesting, as I've done, to stand and listen to them argue with one another about how the symbolism of the memorial is accepted from one perspective and rejected from the other, and vice versa. And that kind of contestation is ongoing. I know next month in February there'll be another rally at the memorial at the park in favor of a more radical version of white supremacy, and there will be counter-protesters who are already organizing. So that's something I've found interesting about the park, is how it's not a settled issue. The memorial carving, one would think, especially coming from outside the region, this is all old history, and it's not. It's an ongoing contest between different interpretations of what the Civil War meant for this region and the United States in general, what the sacrifice was, and what was at stake in the war itself.
So since 1997, when you came to Atlanta and began to be interested in this site, up until now, you witnessed or you learned about multiple other uses of the space.
Yes.
What are those? What are the most significant ones? the most curious ones?
Well, one that I've already mentioned, and I think again it's the Easter sunrise service, which is well established as an annual event that draws thousands of visitors every year. On Easter Sunday morning, the park opens at 5 a.m. and allows visitors to come in, and they assemble for two services at the base of the memorial itself, where when I've observed that the memorial is not mentioned, it's not referenced, it's just a backdrop. And then the main service is at the top of the mountain itself, and that event has the largest number of attendees, and it's a striking event because you can see people walking up the side of the mountain, and it's lit up with flashlights as these pearls of light come up the side of the mountain in the dark to assemble for the dawn service. That's an important event, and I think it's one thing that drew me. More recently, what I've come to observe has been a celebration of a Via Crucis, Good Friday service organized by the local Roman Catholic Church starting in about 2002, I believe. And that event is a reenactment, the Stations of the Cross, which in the Roman Catholic tradition is a reenactment of everything leading up to and including the crucifixion of Jesus. And so the parishioners and others gather, and it's a Spanish-speaking primarily ceremony. There are some English, but primarily Spanish-speaking individuals. Most of the individuals, when I've talked to them, are from Mexico, and they are celebrating something that's important as a way to bond together. They talk about the pueblo, the moving up as a community up the mountainside, and different people volunteer to carry the cross, and it's a point of pride and in the celebration of the event, and they move up from one station to another. More recently, they have individuals volunteering to wear garb, representative of the time. There will be people dressed as Roman soldiers, and others who are dressed as witnesses to the crucifixion event, and they march from station to station up the side of the mountain, and it culminates in a crucifixion event, and Jesus and the thieves are put up on crosses, and they're celebrated. They celebrate the service there. What's a striking juxtaposition for me is that because this occurs 2 days before the Sunday sunrise service, the cross that's used in the sunrise service has already been assembled and put there. And so you have this event that's primarily, I think it's fair to say the Sunday sunrise service can be characterized as primarily a Protestant service. And then you have that cross, and in the background you have the three crosses for what's primarily a Roman Catholic service on that Good Friday. And it's an interesting juxtaposition of the two, and it also represents the changing demographics of the region. And so you see that there are an increasing number of individuals who are moving into the region from South America, Central America, Mexico, and they are appropriating the mountain as theirs to use for this service. Now, the Good Friday service is advertised by Stone Mountain itself on its website. It's a major focal point and attraction. The Good Friday service is not mentioned at all.
So the three uses of the Stone Mountain that you mentioned so far take the place as a sacred place, in a way, in one way or another.
Right.
But there are other non-sacred uses of the
I
space?
think so, and I think that's another thing that I observed, and that was the use of the facilities as a recreational space. And as Stone Mountain, the region around Stone Mountain has changed in its demographics from a primarily white population to increasingly African American. Any day you go out to the park, you can see a number of individuals using the park as an exercise facility. So they're walking around Stone Mountain, they're jogging, they're bicycling. It's a mundane activity, but it's appropriated by them as a daily appropriation of the space for their own. When I've interviewed individuals, African American individuals, and I ask them, well, what do you do with the memorial carving and what that represents? And they tell me, I don't pay attention to that. That's That's not an issue. They've appropriated that space as their own to use as most people would use a park for exercise and recreation. So I think that's an important use of the mountain that may not be recognized by those who are just seeing the controversy over the memorial carving itself. There are other groups that use it for various gatherings, for music events, for cookouts, for a celebration of what's called the Highland Games. And so individuals who trace their heritage to Scotland will assemble once a year for Highland Games and activities related to a recognition of their clan identity. And so that's been a long time event there. There's a Native American powwow festival that's held every October, November, where for a weekend Native American groups will gather from Central America, Mexico, North America, and demonstrate to the visitors what their traditions mean. Ceremonial dances, they have set up events demonstrating how life was lived before colonialism, and so that's another activity that happens. It's not specifically religious.
Absolutely. This is a fascinating site, and I hope that me personally that you will write all this in a book, because this is a perfect book to be read. Really, so many angles into the same place. So maybe just as a final question, and briefly, I would like to ask you, what would you suggest people in Atlanta who may live near or could visit the place? What should they pay attention to?
I think if you go to the park, pay attention to a couple things that may not be on the top of your list. One is there's a museum to the quarrying industry that took place at Stone Mountain. That was a major engine of commerce in the region. Unfortunately, it damaged the mountain considerably and left scars. But the quarry exhibit that was put in place is fascinating, and it details what the individuals who work for the quarrying industry did at that time. There's an old mill that's been put there, and you can look at that. There is what used to be called an antebellum plantation that's now been updated to be called a historic square that does a better job of trying to represent what was happening in antebellum times, but also in early colonial times. And you can look at how cooking was done and different ways of living were done in the 18th and 19th century. And that's an interesting site to look at. And then don't ignore the various important natural resources that are there. It is full of hiking trails and walking trails. There's a natural sanctuary for birds that's been set up. It's just a very rich resource that extends well beyond the memorial carving itself. And my hope is eventually that controversy will be overcome in some way, and the park will be used by more and more individuals as a natural resource in the region.
Thank you so much, Michael.
You're welcome.
And thank you everyone for joining us in this conversation.